David Murren specialises in using the past to predict the future and is an accomplished public speaker, hedge fund manager and market trader. To date, he's authored 3 books, Breaking the Code of History, Lions Led by Lions and Now or Never. His 4th, The Road to Wars, is due to come out in 2021. He also writes a blog on his website www.davidmerrin.co.uk where you can find more on his life, views and work. Hi guys, here we are again, back for season 2. Me and Dad sitting here in the recording studio. Dad, how are you feeling today?
Well, I'm a bit shocked that I'm being interviewed by a man in his dressing gown, but apart from that, I'm feeling good.
I'm a professional, born and bred, what can I say? So today we're going to be looking at the 5 stages of empire, one of Dad's core theories in his work that really underpins a lot of what you say about the world today and how you view it. So it's pretty key to everything, and I realise we haven't done one on this specifically yet, so I thought today's the day. Dad, you up for your first question? Yeah, you are.
Always 2 cups of coffee,
so ready
to go.
Okay, Dad, can you just outline the 5 stages and their basic principles?
The 5 stages of empire are essentially regionalisation, the first stage, driven by expanding demographics, which ends with a civil war which mobilises a right-brain leadership to become more effective and more expansionist. The society at that stage has become more effective and militarised. It then expands away from its borders, down its resource chains, because obviously you've got this military energy which can now be harnessed to expand the state beyond its borders. And that starts the process of algorithmic expansion, which is pretty much exponential. The process of I'm one size, I now beat my neighbour that's same size, I'm now 2 units of size, I now go and beat my next neighbour who's 1 unit of size, I'm now 3 units of size, and that's why it's a non-linear event. Essentially, this system explodes on the world, and if there is no other powerful hegemon to contain it, if there's a power vacuum for it to move into, it does it incredibly effectively. And you only have to look at China over 20 years to see the model in operation and the speed of that expansion. Then there comes a point at the end of expansion to empire when really the limits of that empire have been reached. There will be incremental increase, but it's predominantly being defined by geographic limitations and transportation communication links. Then you enter this period of maturity, and maturity is fascinating because it's a very wealthy society which then starts to undergo social change and social awareness, tolerance, integration, which runs it through the top of maturity, where there's usually some kind of civil war, and that civil war or civil energy of civil war, for example, in Britain was a constitutional revolution with Victoria as the monarch in around 1860, is really a transference of power in some shape or form. And that power
doesn't necessarily have to be violent then.
It doesn't have to be. It is in older rigid systems, but in more modern democracies it can absorb that energy. And what you're really saying is that now the world is a more regular place, that the left-brained leadership and the iterative thought process start to take control, and the mavericks and the radical mindsets that created the empire are no longer useful, and they're gradually filtered out of office. And the danger of that is they're the creative element in the system. So although the system is all powerful and there are no challenges, it coasts along essentially towards the end of maturity with a much less creative, adaptive mindset and more iterative leadership, which looks fine because everything's very secure. And then you move into the next stage, which is overextension. And overextension is very subtle, really. It's where that price of that lack of adaptability and flexibility of leadership and mindset and cultural kind of integration mean that gradually the system isn't paying for itself, starts to incur massive debts because its creativity is decreased, starts to increase the leverage in its society because it can borrow money to compensate for the lack of innate growth. And then you reach this stage at the end of expansion to end of overextension where you end up with a singular event like the Suez or 9/11 where you can see something's fundamentally wrong and there's a major setback to the system. And the system then responds by trying to pretend it can do exactly the same as it did in expansion, and it just doesn't have the resources or the determination to basically counter the ongoing entropy which it encounters from other rising systems. And it collapses faster relatively than people imagine. and that's when it undergoes military setbacks, economic setbacks. And the problem with it is that because the leadership structure is quite encrusted, the system can't manifest great, powerful leadership to rebuild it, because the left-brain iterative thought process has really taken control of it, and you can't get the right-brain leadership up through the system to make the changes required for subsequent adaptation, and then the cycle ends.
So just to go over the 5 stages of regionalisation: ascension, maturity, overextension, and then decline and legacy.
Yes.
What's the difference between regionalisation and ascension?
It's really the rate of change. So regionalisation is a bit like the best way to describe it is you go to school and you go to junior school, middle school, you go to secondary school, you go to sixth form college, you go to university. You've adapted yourself to best practice. You've basically defined who you are, and you probably had a revolution in the process of rejecting some of your parents' values, and essentially in the desire to be more adaptive to the environment you now face. That fascinating stage where teenagers rebel against their parents is really an adaptation phase. It's like saying, are all the values you've given us appropriate to the environment I now face? And it's a very healthy process, and that's really what a civil war is at the end of regionalisation. It's an adaptive process.
So the civil wars occur in regionalisation and also in maturity.
Yes,
and
at the peak of maturity.
And those are power changes.
Those
in
are
the
shifts.
system.
And in fact, one is a left brain, right brain shift, and the other is a right brain, left brain shift.
So the first goes, the right-brained leadership takes over society, and then expansion occurs.
Yes.
And then in maturity, at the height of power, the left-brain leadership then
starts to
overturns
dominate,
the
because
leadership.
there are very few overt surprises to the system. It's so powerful that type of leadership can actually appear to sustain itself.
And to boil it down, when you say left versus right-brained, what you're saying, I feel, is right individualistic, like out-the-box thinking, whereas left-brained are more by the books, a bit more controlled.
They're like, well, not so much because control can exist in both characteristics, but far more dealing with the next step of what I do tomorrow or the next day, whereas right brain thinking would be what I do next year, what I do the year afterwards.
Yeah.
Long range strategic thinking, tactical understanding, all of those strategic processes which allow someone to play a game on a completely different level.
So I'm sure you get asked a lot what examples you use to back up your theories. What examples do you use to back this up? Can this be applied to ancient history? Can this be applied to the Middle Ages?
So let's just look at Britain. Let's look at the English Civil War and Brexit and their parallels, because they're uncanny. Essentially, the English Civil War, Charles I on the throne, he was a Catholic, and Catholicism was highly controlling. You accessed your God via the church, and the church gained power through being that intermediary. And the Protestants came along with this very threatening idea, and I can talk to God directly. I don't need you. I can just talk to him. You imagine what that meant for the Catholic faith. It was a horrendous concept. And so this idea of disintermediation and direct access to the divine represented the protesters or the Protestants. And in the same way, the divinity of Charles I, he believed he had the absolute right to rule because God had given him that right. That was the whole prerequisite of the throne. And really, the parliamentarians came along and said, actually, we want more representation, and you have to listen to us. And Charles is thinking, well, I'm divinely appointed. I don't have to listen to anyone. And you can see the scene is set. And the scene is set by the demographic structure of Britain, which is this massively increased base through population expansion of the poor, and a few at the top who got richer and richer because of that dynamic, really, and the disparity being so great. And that's the interesting bit. It starts off with a few people who protest. And actually, this is where it's fascinating. They start to protest, and people go, they're a bunch of protesters. But what really does it is the harsh response by the leadership at the top. And that harsh response actually illuminates who they really are. And more people build. So the Civil War didn't erupt. It erupted because a few protesters were poorly treated by Charles I, and they didn't see the overthrow of the monarchy as their end goal. But it became more and more...
Just kind of happened.
It happened because of the response, and the response being so, extreme that it triggered all of the senses of injustice in the people, and the whole thing got more and more and more. And the more they used force, the more force actually begat the opposition.
And That was regionalisation, civil war.
That was and so you talked about the modern day. The modern day process of Brexit is really interesting, and I've been a voice sort of less so now, but certainly for a decade in the wilderness by highlighting that Britain lost its empire at the bottom of the cycle in 1970. And actually, we had restarted our new empire cycle, and we'd been in a new phase of regionalisation from 1970 onwards. And Thatcher was, a catalytic gift to the country, and she kick-started a new dynamic England with a greater sense of self-identity. And the trigger there was winning the Falklands conflict, actually being prepared to fight for something and against the odds winning it. And that self-identity fed through, and motivation of a population that were entrepreneurial.
With regionalisation and conquest and expansion, doesn't that require states to take stuff that really isn't theirs, whereas what we were doing was more defending what was ours? So is that not a symptom of decline or overextension where you're defending your own territory?
You mean in the Civil War or now?
Now, in the Falklands War, sorry. I'm talking about the Falklands War.
Well,
so you were saying it's part of regionalisation and Britain's new regionalisation process, and I'm saying it seems to be more a symptom of overextension because you're defending your lands from attack.
Well, it marked the end of the decline by saying we're not giving up any more of our territory. And it brought the self-identity which started the process, or was at the beginning of the process, of regionalisation. It was like saying you can't have something, you can't take it from us, we'll fight for it. And it had far-reaching implications, because in the Kremlin they'd viewed capitalism as weak and like a rotten apple that would fall from a tree at the appropriate moment. And so when Britain fought 8,000 miles away from its homelands, they completely changed their view. And when their economy collapsed and their large army sat on the borders of Europe, you could argue that they didn't take the risk of using their military in the last throw of the dice because Britain had proven as a nuclear power it wouldn't tolerate it. And I think that's really where deterrence comes from. So that was a start of self-identity. Thatcher did many other things. She motivated a sleepy system, a socialist system, and created the dynamism that actually coasted us all the way through into the Brexit decision.
If Brexit was a civil war of regionalisation, or our new regionalisation, where was Britain's civil war of maturity? Was that the handover of power from monarchy to parliament?
That was a constitutional revolution with Victoria. And it was a massive struggle that's not really talked about, where the monarchy had to give practically all its power to parliament in around 1860. And Albert was very significant as the Prince Consort in terms of understanding that the monarchy couldn't continue in its current form. And it's a period that we don't really think about, but there was a huge amount of energy and dynamism around that shift of power to Parliament. And that was the first example, interesting enough. If you look at changes in pattern, normally there are physical, violent conflicts associated with civil war of regionalisation and maturity. Britain is showing something which I think we should be really proud of. It's for the first time in human affairs that in the top of the peak, the constitutional revolution was a peaceful revolution. And similarly, Brexit was a peaceful civil war, which I think is a step forward in terms of human organisation. It has some downsides, and that is the Darwinistic process of natural selection that wars bring makes sure that the best leaders rise to the top because they're tested in battle. And you can't it filters out incompetence and people are unable to lead. And so it creates, it's a leadership challenge in the most brutal way. And the trouble with Brexit is Brexit didn't have any of that brutality. So the legacy of the old, civil service forms of government and members of this current government, they haven't really been tested in fire. And as we found out in the pandemic, many of them weren't up to it and are not up to it.
Could you say that people who haven't been tested in fire require things like the pandemic? They require those tests to become better people. I mean, no, like Navy SEAL is going to be hard as nails at birth. It's about the trials and tests you go through.
It is
to make you a better person.
And you become battle hardened. But if you'll notice that there hasn't been any rotation of incompetence, the Ministry of Education has been appallingly led. I would argue that the Department of Health has not been well led. I mean,
you love Hancock.
I'm sorry. I think there are a group of ministers, and actually I think Boris is subject to the advisory capability of the people close to him. So Lord Frost did a great job on Brexit, and Boris listened, and he benefited. But in terms of the pandemic advice, it has been appalling, from Gove to Hancock to Whitty to Valence. Those guys have an awful lot to answer for in terms of running their own agendas and not applying logical processes to minimise the damage.
What do you reckon, Dad? Politician ahead of you?
I think I might be viewed as
PM?
a very intolerant politician towards incompetence.
Looking at other areas of the world, because I realise we've just really been looking at Britain, it's a little bit Western-centric. With regionalisation, you've said in your work, and I'm quoting here, timing is crucial as to whether or not a new empire comes of age. In regards to India and China, India can be seen as a regional power, coming and ascending to, trying to reach empire, whereas China, right next to it, is ahead of the curve. They're already kind of there. They're the kind of Eastern empire that's the hegemon right now in that area of the world. Does that mean that India, because of its proximity to China, is just going to be capped at a regional power? Is it kind of doomed to fail in its rise because it's right next to
It's a great
Chinese
question. It's a great
power?
question. So if you look at China's civil war, officially ending around the 50s, and then it's really been an expansion to empire from the 50s onwards. But that expansion has been incremental.
It's been ascending to empire.
It's
so
been in the process.
Regionalisation at the end of
the 50s, the Civil War, and then subsequently it's been trying to expand in the early phases, but as you quite rightly said, contained by the hegemonic power of America. It's really been a slow, incremental process for it. And that basically, the timing of the expanding system is dictated by the decline of the hegemonic system, and the vacuum needs to be created because you can't force that vacuum because they're so much more powerful. And so essentially, as after 9/11, American power really started to be on the wane as it focused on the terrorist threats, which never were going to change the substance of its existence. And that gave the smokescreen for China to really make inroads, coupled with this deception that it would get America and the West to invest in its manufacturing base with a cheap labour form that it would benefit by manufacturing for the world, which is really a giant IP trap. And at the same time, India is behind by about a decade and a half, I'd say. So you're right. Now, the timing for India is that India is allied with the West, Japan, Australia, America, and more so Britain as it moves into that trading zone with a military perspective of securing trade routes. So right now the whole world is seeking, bar Russia, seeking to contain the expansion of China. And India knows that if it doesn't join that, it's got a direct problem anyway, as we see in the Himalayas.
They have a lot of border clashes. I read that one last year where 100 people got killed with sticks and stuff, pushing each other off cliffs.
They've got this sort of agreed process where they don't use gunpowder weapons and rifles and guns, so they go around with clubs and nails, and they put their best combat regiments in there, and they fight physically for territory. It's a very interesting sort of reduction to the archaic form of warfare rather than seeing escalation, which is really interesting. But nonetheless, it represents huge Chinese expansive energy on every border zone that they operate under. Indians are well aware that they cannot contain the Chinese alone, but as part of the alliance in the Quad or the next five or the Quint, whatever it becomes, they are significant, and their aspirations to build a 400 plus ship navy are designed to cut the supply lines from the Gulf to China with respect to energy and oil. So they're looking for different ways to create leverage and protection. But nonetheless, it's China which is the expanding system, and India is behind it. Now, India does play a really key part, and I've long since argued that the Chinese understand that America and the West are in decline. If they waited long enough, they would naturally win. But just like Germany in the First World War and in the Second World War, Russia forced a timetable upon them. It was a rearmament of Russia with French help that triggered the timing in 1914 that they felt they had to move now. They had the optimum forces versus the French and the British, both at sea and in the air, they were going to create, and if they waited any longer, they'd have a giant on their eastern doorstep, then they'd fight on two fronts. And it was exactly the same with Hitler in the Second World War. So India is like Russia was to Germany in World War I and World War II. It's caused, I think, Xi to come to the conclusion that unless he's the hegemonically dominant power by 2030 he won't make it, because India will start to close the gap on the other side.
Do you think a similar situation could play out where India, being what Russia was, with alliances, eventually, as in the Second World War, overcomes China? Or do you think its chances of expanding are looking pretty slim right now with the global view that you have?
Well, I think China's expansion is just like America's expansion was dependent on Britain losing power, and America inherited its cousin's empire by moving into Britain's vacuum as it shrunk. So the Indians can't do it alone. They're not going to, because it's first one to dominant hegemon and you can't get there afterwards. India can do it in the containment of China. If it's successful and China is therefore limited and inhibited, India will be the beneficiary of it. But right now it takes everyone to contain the forces of China. They are without precedent the greatest expansionary system we have ever seen in the world.
Because of numbers and technology combined in
Yes.
the modern world of communications.
And also, we all in democracy take for granted that the mobilization of society's maximum output comes through the mobilization of individuals. That's what democracy is really about. The freedom of mobilization to contribute on an individual level that creates the largest input for a collective. The Chinese have a very different system. It's truly collective. It was always collective, and it oscillates in the amount of degree. And Xi has become probably the most powerful dictator the world's ever seen, using modern systems of observation and AI programs. He has rooted out individuals, threatening individuals against him, and that's their one Achilles heel. That if you can destroy the top of the command system in that Chinese CCP model, the whole system below it becomes far more vulnerable. Whereas, we've always had a sort of devolved command structure potential in the West, and that's been one of our USPs. That's a really key difference, which is interesting and worth, I think, the Achilles heel of the system they've created. But before that, it's all about mass. It's all about, and they're very strategically clever.
Moving on to different areas of the world now. What about a Latin or African empire? You talked about Western Christian empires and you talked about Eastern empires. Well, the idea of a super empire where a succession of states, for those who don't know, follows one another from the same geographical area. We've had the Western Christian empire and the Eastern empire is now rising. But anyway, Dad, what about Latin America or Africa? Are they going to, in the future, become empires themselves? Or?
Well, if everyone else left them alone and they were isolated, Brazil would be the dominant ultimate powerhouse in Latin America. I think that's fairly obvious. Latin America does have a fascinating quality, and I've often pondered why some systems self-organize better than others.
When you say self-organized, what do you mean?
Well, an empire, or the 5 stages of empire, is about self-organization. It's about how a group of human beings create a social structure, manifest effective leadership, and therefore manifest greater security and power for the collective system. And intrinsic to that is the ability to identify high-quality leadership. And some systems find and manifest high-quality leadership, although their people may criticize them. Relatively, they're able to make pretty good decisions on average over time. And other systems just consistently elect poor leaders. Argentina is a good example. It can't find a good leader for love nor money. Consistently it's been led by destructive personas that benefited themselves and not the nation. And the whole of Latin America really falls into that category of being unable to elect good leadership that's supported by powerful governmental systems.
Couldn't you argue that that's very similar to European monarchs on the whole for hundreds of years in the Middle Ages? Maybe they're just at the stage where they're doing that and progress a couple hundred years, yes, or even sooner.
Given time, there's no doubt that there's in one of my most recent theory about human anti-entropy. It's this thing that we do when we collectively organise to hold back time and the entropy of the universe. Essentially, we will all seek to self-organise. It's just a matter of how quickly we do it. And we need competition because competition stimulates and accelerates that evolution. So I think that, yes, left alone they would, but I don't think they have natural advantages. For some reason, their organisational processes are not as good as the ones we saw in Northern Europe that begat the Western world.
What about Africa?
Africa's even further behind in some ways. And I really, I have a real fondness for Africa. I think they really do have a problem manifesting leaders that serve their people, and that's exactly how I describe it in Latin America. They're serving themselves, not their people. In Africa, they're close to their tribal roots, and if you're a tribal chief, then you're a king, and if you're a king, you own anything you govern. So you don't serve the people as much as they serve you. And I think that's probably created a more fertile environment for large-scale corruption than probably any other country, and avert corruption. And then enter the Chinese, and the Chinese have used that against the people and the leaders in such a way as they have incredible political control. And the West hasn't even begun to understand the degree it needs to go to counter it. I was warning about it in 2003, 4 and 5, that Africa was going to be controlled by China if the West didn't step up and provide effective counter-investment and options against the Chinese process. And now there's an awful lot in the press, quite rightly, about debt colonialism, where the Chinese lend money knowing it will never be repaid, and then they take control of the assets and parts of the country, and all of a sudden they have greater influence.
Talking about rising and falling powers, because that's fundamentally what this cycle is about. You've stated quite often that the West is in decline, and that includes America. Can decline be stopped? Like, is it possible to prevent it, or can you only really slow it down?
Well, it's really interesting, and obviously being a part of the Western world that I don't want to see lose traction. I've asked this question a lot. The issue about decline is you can't get the right leadership to manifest. Look at America right now. I mean, America's leadership has been diabolical. George Bush was well-meaning, but gullible enough to be manipulated by his chief advisors, Cheney and Rumsfeld. Obama, I have to say, was the beginning of the narcissistic trend, and he was deeply destructive to American influences. Trump was, a walking, talking disaster area. The policies that he promised he would enact to make America safer, he didn't enact. And he did untold damage to the institutions of America. And Biden, whilst he's a good human being, I suspect, is completely ineffective. And the beginning of his mistake, the curves of mistake, are he represents a socialist movement, and socialism never really grew any system. The only reason communism worked in the Cold War was because they had an upward commodity cycle from 1950 to 1975. That was the basis of communist success in Russia. And similarly, socialism, as we found in Britain, really was the end of a system, not the beginning of a system. So Biden isn't strong enough, I think, to really reconstruct it. And unless you could suddenly reconstruct the party system, the way the parties work, to get the right leader to the top, I don't see that. And it's almost as if the whole thing has to collapse to rebirth itself, rather than consciously reorganize itself, partly because most people are not even aware of the way the current structure limits the growth of America. Most people just want to think it's all okay and it'll just carry on day to day. They just can't contemplate the changes really needed to rejuvenate the system. Look at Britain. We went from the end of the Second World War, we literally slid down a slope into 1970.
So basically what you're saying is that the decline can't be stopped unless fantastic leadership is found, and that's unlikely. It's unlikely,
and more importantly, I think if you think of individual experience, we don't grow if things are working out the way we expected. We only grow when we have a disaster or a truly stressful time. We take our lessons and we employ them and we do different things. And societies are exactly the same. Britain had to go through that dark period prior to the arrival of Thatcher in the 70s, and it was really dark. Power cuts, riots. This great empire had fallen on its knees before it was ready to reform and change. And Thatcher was the agent that did it, but the system was ready for it. Although she had to fight, many incumbent people who wouldn't change, it was ready for that moment. And until America really goes through that, it can't reform and it can't start doing it all over again. And I think that we will see Biden's term as very much James Callaghan's turn was before Thatcher turned up. Pretty disastrous in retrospective rearview mirror.
Do you think America's decline will be stopped or not?
Look, the real issue is you can't stop it. It's a bit like being an old man. You can't stop being older, but you can look after yourself and do the right things to live longer and wisely, and then you can pass your knowledge to the next generation so that it's a seamless transition. And I really, I'm interested by the way that the royal family are operating right now, in terms of the Queen's obviously suffering terribly with the loss of the Duke. Charles is stepping up to the plate. He discusses the future of the monarchy with William, because you're looking at a Queen, a King and a King, all in waiting, discussing the future of the construct that they lead and are part of. That's really fascinating. And it's rather than I'm a king and I die and then it's up to you, buddy. And then you live your life and it's up to you. And everyone has a different version. It's a continuity in thought. I think that's quite indicative of Britain's upward expansive energy. And when I wrote Breaking the Code of History, hadn't twigged that Britain was where it was. And I had one intelligence measure, which was rising Olympic medals. And when we came third, and mainly because of the lottery program that John Major put into place, I thought something interesting was happening. When we came second, I knew that British national energy was in a completely different place from how we felt and the social mood around us. And it's turned out to be a very good indicator.
I was right, if I don't say so myself.
Well, in this case, yes.
What can I say? So, your map is called the 5 Stages of Empire Cycle. Keyword, cycle. Does it only provide us with the knowledge of what's to come, but leave us powerless to do anything apart from temporarily halt the cycle?
So when I first started writing about it, it was an incredible journey to realise I'd come across an underlying pattern that really had validity across all the empires I studied for thousands of years. They did the same things. And so then my next question is, well, could we change the cycle, as you've asked me? And my analogy is that if you're a drunk, you're 51% or an addict of some kind. You're 51% of the way onto the road to change when you can identify that you are an addict. And so this stage of my work is really about explaining to people, this is who we are. We're not a group of individuals making smart decisions. We're a giant unconscious collective organism that keeps repeating its same innate patterns. And that unless we become aware of them, we can't take real choices. We're just following a pattern and thinking that we're individuals and making individual decisions. We're not. We're making collective decisions. So an awful lot of what Breaking the Code was about was a self-help book, bringing to people's attention these cycles and how they operate, so we have choice. And I think Britain going through Brexit the way it did is actually a tick for that, that hope and aspiration. Around the rest of the world, there's an awful lot of darkness. And I think the next piece that I talked about in the book is that there would come a time, and you have to ask the question, it's a big one, because conflict is part of the empire cycle, and there's a particular subset about wars and empires, when they happen, how they happen, and their very nature. How does a young nation fight an old nation? Who has the advantages of energy and duration? And there's a whole section on the site about my theory of warfare, which means that wars are not wars. Some are civil wars, some are wars of regionalisation, some are civil wars of maturity, some are wars of expansion. What's it like to be in a war of expansion when you're defending your territory? Who's got the real advantages? And that's all covered in my work. But what really the biggest issue is that why do wars keep happening? We all say we don't like them, yet we keep doing it. And I've come to the conclusion that we've used warfare in a Darwinistic way to really remove social systems which are old and decayed. And then they've been replaced by stronger systems. And on the whole, if you take past 2,000 years, human organisation and collectivity and influence on the world around us has become stronger and stronger through that process. But I think we're now at the stage where warfare is too destructive for us to contemplate the level of industrial conflict like World War III. And if we go to that place, and the country that thinks we can go to that place will believe the war is winnable, because they wouldn't do it otherwise. But if they believe it's winnable and the unintended consequences are nuclear exchanges, we've finally met the limits of our human collective expansion strategy, which is Darwinistic conflict to create the best and most capable human systems in these cycles at the peak with the most anti-entropy to give us the most control over our environment to perpetuate our genes. And I think we have come up against the buttress and limits of that.
Basically, MAD may change the cycle.
MAD is exactly right. The risk of MAD, we got through it through the Cold War, mainly because they were two old systems. It's a little bit like the Roman Empire split east to west. you really got to think about the Western Christian Empire that split into the Western legacy and the USSR that became communist because it was the opposite of democracy by polarization. But in the end, they were old systems in decline. And especially when you look at Russia's demographics, you can see that decline. And old systems are far less aggressive than you think. The danger is the new expansive energy of China is young, and it doesn't respect any of those inhibitions. And that's why this decade is probably more dangerous than any other decade humanity's faced. And I think we could go to that edge of the precipice of conflict and draw back, realizing that we face the destruction of our race, not the optimization of our anti-entropy in the next system.
On that happy note, thank you guys for listening. I think that's about it with the questions. We will have a part 2 where I compare Dad's theory to other contemporary historians and see how he reacts and how he takes the thunder. If you want to hear more about Dad, go to his website, www.davidmoen.com. I don't have a website because I am not as famous as Dad. Sad life. Thank you, everyone. Cheers, Dad.
Thank you, Winnie. It's always a pleasure. You do make me smile.